If you ever want to disappear without dying, just rent a quiet apartment above a florist's shop in a town small enough that the streetlights hum louder than the neighbors. That's what Isaac had told himself the day he moved into Willow Ridge, a place with a name soft enough to forget but sharp enough to stay lodged under the skin like an old splinter. He wasn't running, exactly, he'd just had enough of pretending his 20s meant anything when every year had started to feel like a copy of a copy, a flickering loop of internships, temp jobs, half-sincere dating apps, and parents who only called to remind him of how far behind he'd fallen. He wanted space. He wanted silence. He wanted, more than anything, something real even if it cut him. That's why he noticed her. She wasn't supposed to be there. A woman like her, in a place like this, too elegant in the way of someone who had long since stopped caring about being elegant. He'd first seen her on a Tuesday morning, stepping out of a navy blue Audi that didn't belong to anyone in town. She wore a dark green coat buttoned all the way up even though the September air was already losing its summer teeth, and she moved like she was used to people watching her and had grown tired of it. She wasn't beautiful the way Instagram or magazines told you someone should be, her lipstick was too dark for her skin tone, and her hair was pinned back carelessly like she hadn't looked in a mirror. But God, Isaac couldn't look away. He watched her as she passed the florist's window, not noticing him behind the glass. She was older, definitely older, 40s, maybe mid. She had that worn, half-faded grace of someone who had spent years being one thing and had just recently, and without permission, become another. That's what made her beautiful to him. She looked imperfect. She looked alive. For 3 days, she returned to the antique bookstore next to the florist. She never bought anything, just browsed, her fingers brushing the cracked spines like they were fragile things that could still surprise her. On the 4th day, Isaac caught her eyes as she stepped out and made her way to the sidewalk. He didn't mean to say anything, but sometimes truth slips out before sense can catch it. "You never buy anything," he called out, holding a bundle of hydrangeas wrapped in brown paper, headed for a delivery. "You just touch the books like they owe you something." She stopped. Turned. That slow, deliberate turning that makes you wonder if you've just made a mistake. "I like the smell," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, smoky around the edges like she'd once smoked for the company of it and then stopped for someone who left anyway. "Old paper reminds me that time didn't eat everything." He nodded, stunned. "That's kind of beautiful." "It's not," she said, stepping closer. "It's just true." She walked past him without another word, her perfume lingering, a mix of bergamot and something bitter underneath, like orange peel and black coffee. He stood there longer than necessary, late for a delivery, but unsure if he'd just hallucinated the entire thing. The next day, he left a book outside the shop's doorstep, the bell jar, one of the sad ones with a heartbeat. No note, no explanation. Just left it there with a ribbon tied around it, hoping the wind wouldn't blow it into the gutter. She took it. He saw her from the florist's window, pausing for a long minute before lifting it into her bag like she was cradling something fragile, almost sacred. 2 days later, she returned the favor. She handed him a small, worn copy of Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, didn't say a word. Just slid it across the counter while he was pretending to read a delivery invoice. When he looked up, her face didn't match her reputation. The usual coolness, the practiced poise, gone. For the first time, there was something else, softness, hesitation, maybe even a kind of unguarded gratitude. He tilted his head. "I didn't even know we were playing this game." "We're not," she replied. "But if we were, I'm winning." That made him laugh, really laugh, not the polite, flirty kind he gave people his age when they were trying too hard. And just like that, a smile cracked across her face like light between curtains. Not a polite one. Not the frozen kind you give cashiers and family friends. A real one. And Isaac saw it for what it was, her first in a long, long time. It disarmed him. The next time she came in, he asked her name. "Juliet," she said, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. "And yes, the irony isn't lost on me." He chuckled. "So? Juliet. No Romeo?" She smirked but didn't answer. Her silence wasn't cold, just deliberate, like she was choosing which truths he could handle. Over the next week, their conversations sharpened. They didn't talk like people just meeting. They talked like people who'd skipped the boring middle. They talked about the kind of books that taught you how to grieve properly, the songs that hurt in a good way, and the ways people grow lonely even when surrounded by love. Juliet never asked why Isaac, at 23, was delivering flowers for a living in a town like this. He never asked what brought her here in clothes too expensive for the sidewalks. There was something unspoken between them, a shared bruising. They didn't press it. But they felt it. And then came the rain. A Saturday. The kind of gray that makes the world feel underwater. She was caught without an umbrella, pressed against the bookstore's brick wall like a misfit oil painting in the wrong gallery. Isaac didn't even think. He opened the florist's side door and held out the biggest umbrella he could find. She blinked, surprised. "What are you doing?" He grinned. "Offering temporary shelter to beautiful strangers." She raised an eyebrow. "You shouldn't call women beautiful like that." "Why not?" "Because you're too young to mean it the way you said it." He stepped forward anyway, holding the umbrella over her, and for a moment, just one moment, she didn't step back. The street was empty, the rain too loud to make the silence awkward. And that's when it happened. A laugh. From her. A real, unstuck from time, unfiltered laugh that spilled out of her like it had been caged too long. "You're dangerous," she said, shaking her head as she finally took the umbrella and turned to go. "And you're still here," he replied. She didn't look back. But she didn't walk fast, either. The first time Isaac kissed her, it didn't feel like a milestone or some defining turn in the story of his life. It felt like standing too close to something dangerous and not moving away, because for once, the danger didn't come with warnings or alarms, just a quiet pull that made everything else seem further away. It happened in the back hallway of the bookstore, where the owner, a distracted man with more debt than sense, had asked Juliet to help organize a donation shelf, and Isaac had offered to lift boxes under the pretense of being helpful when he really just wanted 10 more minutes of her attention. She had laughed at something he said about the smell of moldy pages and how every small-town bookstore probably had one haunted corner. Then she turned to say something else, but her face had stopped halfway through the sentence, and in that space between thought and breath, his hand had touched her wrist lightly, and her mouth had found his. No one spoke after it happened, and she didn't kiss him again that day. But the door was open now, and neither of them shut it. It wasn't passion in the way people used that word casually. It wasn't stolen glances and tangled sheets and impossible declarations. It was quieter, more careful, layered with the understanding that there was a line that had been crossed, and once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. She didn't rush him. He didn't demand anything from her. Their messages became more deliberate. She never used emojis. He never pushed for her number, but she gave it to him anyway one night after a long walk that ended with her saying, "I don't need this," and him replying, "I know. That's why I'm still here." There were things they never talked about. She never mentioned whether she was married or divorced or just done with the idea of being legally attached to anyone. He never asked what she did outside of her visits to the bookstore or why she had taken a short-term lease in a place where no one knew her name. But others noticed, of course. Willow Ridge was not a place where people had secrets for long. The town wasn't cruel, just habitual. People noticed when someone didn't belong. And Juliet didn't belong, not in the way they measured such things. She lived in a restored craftsman house at the edge of the neighborhood where every lawn had a gardener and every porch had the same 2 rocking chairs. Isaac had only been there once, when she'd invited him to help her move a bookshelf from her garage into her study, and even then, she kept the windows closed and the lights dimmed, as though she was used to being seen but not looked at. The house was full of things that were too expensive to belong to someone living alone: framed black and white photographs of unnamed cities, a piano no one played, a wine rack that was always full. But the study, where she let him stay for an hour after the bookshelf was in place, was the only room that felt lived in. It was full of scattered notebooks, old receipts used as bookmarks, coffee stains on coasters that had long given up looking new. They started seeing each other late. Not because they were hiding, but because daylight made everything louder, and their time together only worked when the world quieted down. He would walk to her place with his hoodie up, even when the weather was warm, and she would greet him at the back door, never the front. Sometimes they sat on the floor and talked about things that didn't matter, how she once wanted to be a journalist before she stopped believing in the truth, how he hated the sound of mechanical clocks, how neither of them liked being asked where they saw themselves in 5 years. Sometimes she would ask him to read to her, always poetry, never novels, and he would do it without hesitation, even when he stumbled over the German names or the outdated punctuation. They had rules, unspoken but firm. No one else could know. No gifts, unless they came with a reason. No photographs. No goodbyes, just silence when the night ended. And still, it felt real. Until the message came. He was at the florist, counting vases for the week's orders, when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. The text was brief. "She's not yours. Be careful." That was all. No name. No context. Just a single sentence that instantly cracked through the world he thought they'd built. He stared at it for a long time before responding, only to find the number was no longer in service. It wasn't a friend. It wasn't a prank. It felt targeted. It felt personal. He didn't show her the message immediately. For the first time since they met, he felt something that didn't belong between them, hesitation. It stayed in his pocket like a loaded question. When they met the next evening, he didn't speak for the first few minutes. She noticed right away. "You're quieter than usual," she said as she poured them both a glass of wine. "Got a weird text today." She set her glass down, just slightly too hard. "From who?" "Didn't say. Just said you're not mine." She didn't blink. "That's true. That's not the part that got me." He saw the shift in her posture before she even answered. "Isaac, people talk. They assume. And when they don't understand something, they invent reasons to be angry about it. But this wasn't gossip. This felt like someone new. I'm not married. I'm not involved with anyone. If that's what you're afraid of, then what are we doing, Juliet?" Her face changed again, this time slower. Less guarded. She stepped toward him and reached for his hand, her thumb tracing the knuckle like she was memorizing something that wouldn't last. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I wasn't lying when I said I hadn't smiled in years. I wasn't lying when I let you in. And I'm not lying now." He nodded, holding her gaze. But the air between them wasn't the same. Something else had entered the room, something neither of them had invited, but that neither could ignore. They didn't speak the rest of the night. But neither of them let go. Not yet. For the next few nights, Isaac felt like the hours stretched longer than they should, each one carrying a question he didn't know how to ask. He kept going to work at the florist's, kept walking past the bookstore, kept hoping Juliet would appear like she had all those days ago, carrying nothing but time and silence. But she didn't. Not until Thursday, when she stepped in just before closing, wearing the same coat, her expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just finished trimming a stem before placing a wrapped bouquet into the cooler. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him with the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable, but he had stopped feeling nervous around her weeks ago. She asked if he wanted to come by that night, and even though he had already planned to, the way she said it felt different. Less like an invitation, more like a test. He nodded without speaking, locked up early, and followed her in his usual pattern, back alleys, side streets, always arriving from the opposite side of her block so that no neighbor could draw a line between their two addresses. When he entered, she didn't bother with small talk or drinks. She led him into the study, sat across from him on the rug, and held out a manila folder. Inside were 2 photographs. One of her. One of him. Both printed on the same kind of low-resolution paper used in security offices or school admin files. No words. No captions. Just the implication. He looked up slowly. "Who gave you these?" "I got them in the mail yesterday." No return address. No note. "Someone's watching us." "Someone was watching me before you ever walked into my life." The answer landed harder than he expected, not because it was dramatic or shocking, but because it was spoken like a fact she had long since accepted. She didn't seem surprised, and that was worse than anything. He asked if she was in danger, and she shook her head like the question itself missed the point. She didn't explain, didn't name anyone, didn't offer background. It was like she had already decided what parts of her life belonged to him and which ones he was not allowed to carry. They sat in silence for a long time before she asked him if he wanted to stop this. He didn't know how to answer. Stopping would have been safer. Simpler. But he wasn't interested in safety. He had spent most of his life watching things happen to him instead of doing anything that mattered. And if there was one thing that felt real lately, it was this. He said no. She nodded, then left the room for a few minutes and returned wearing a black t-shirt and no makeup, her hair tied back like she didn't care if he saw the lines at the corners of her eyes. That night, they didn't touch. They just lay on the floor beside each other, not even using the couch, as though being level with the ground made everything more honest. She told him about her sister who hadn't spoken to her in over a year, about a decision she made in her 30s that had cost her people she thought would never leave. He didn't ask what the decision was. He told her about the time his father asked him why he hadn't finished college, how he had no good answer except that it didn't feel like it was building toward anything. She listened without correcting him, without offering advice or trying to make the conversation productive. When the clock hit midnight, she reached for his hand and didn't let go. There was no need to explain what it meant. Neither of them believed in promises. But that moment was enough to keep both of them from walking away. The next afternoon, the bookstore's owner pulled Isaac aside and asked if he could help move a delivery into storage. It wasn't a strange request, but the way he said it felt staged. Isaac followed him to the back, lifted 3 boxes of used trade paperbacks, and then, after a pause that felt unnecessary, the man cleared his throat and asked if he was spending time with Juliet. The phrasing was careful. Not judgmental, just cautious. Isaac didn't answer right away. He waited to see if the man would push the question, but instead, he shrugged and said that someone had been asking questions, someone not from town. A man, maybe mid-40s, clean-cut, polite in that rehearsed way that people use when they're trying not to reveal their real reason for being somewhere. Isaac didn't know what to say. He asked what the man looked like, but the description didn't help. Generic. Well-dressed. Expensive watch. No name. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Juliet hadn't mentioned anyone visiting her. She hadn't changed her routine. And yet, now there was someone wandering around town with an interest in her and enough knowledge to ask about Isaac specifically. That night, he walked to her place with more urgency than usual, his hood tighter around his head, and his steps fast enough that he arrived early. She opened the door with no expression, like she had expected him before he even knocked. Before he could speak, she said someone had knocked on her door that morning but left before she could answer. She didn't seem nervous. Just tired. "Why are they following you?" he asked. "They're not," she said. "But they know about me. They've known about you since the bookstore." He waited for more, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she went into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. No wine. No music. The silence felt heavier than usual, not tense, but full. She handed him the glass and leaned against the counter like nothing had changed. Then came the voice. Outside. Faint but clear enough to be heard through the closed window near the hallway. A car slowing down. A passenger side door opening. Footsteps. Juliet's face didn't change, but her hands stiffened around the glass. Isaac stepped toward the window, but she shook her head. "Don't look. If they see you, it'll only get worse." "Who is it?" "It doesn't matter." "I think it does." She finally met his eyes again. "You'll have to decide whether this is worth it, knowing it doesn't come without people watching." "I already decided," he said, louder than he intended. Someone outside stepped onto the porch. Then, after a few seconds, left. Neither of them moved for a while after that. Later that night, when he walked home, he passed the bookstore and saw a man in a dark coat across the street, standing still. Not moving. Not watching anything in particular. Just standing. Isaac didn't stop. But he knew they were being watched. And he knew someone had seen them together. On Sunday, Isaac didn't go to Juliet's house. He didn't message her. He didn't walk past the bookstore or the florist shop or any place he thought she might be. Instead, he took a long bus ride to the next town over, sat at the back of a nearly empty diner for 2 hours, and wrote down everything he could remember about the man outside her house, the voice in the hallway, the envelope of photographs, and the silence Juliet had offered him in place of explanation. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, but trust without understanding eventually stops feeling like trust and starts feeling like submission. He had been quiet long enough. He needed more than half answers and carefully delivered looks. When he finally returned home, he found a letter taped to his apartment door in handwriting he recognized immediately. It was hers. It said only, "Come tomorrow." "I'll explain." The next evening, she opened the door without speaking, stepped aside, and led him into the living room, which for the first time looked like someone had been pacing through it for hours. There were books scattered across the table, the piano lid open with music sheets unfolded, a glass of water untouched on the side table next to a turned-off lamp. Juliet sat down on the arm of the couch, didn't offer a drink, and didn't ease into it. "I used to be married," she said. "His name is Daniel. He works in finance, lives in the city, and doesn't like losing control of things he thinks belong to him." Isaac didn't interrupt. He just sat across from her, waiting. He wasn't abusive. Not in the obvious way. He never hit me or screamed or threatened. He just watched everything I did, kept track of conversations, questioned my tone, asked me to rephrase things until I said what he wanted. When I left him, he didn't try to stop me. He just told me I'd be back. That no one else would last. Isaac kept his hands in his lap. He wanted to ask a dozen things, but none of them felt like they would help. "I had some money saved. I took what I needed and moved here under a short-term agreement with a property manager who doesn't ask questions. He found out where I was 3 weeks ago. That's when I stopped sleeping." "And the photos?" "He sends those to remind me that he's always one step behind. He doesn't want me back. He just wants to prove he's still part of my life." Isaac leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me any of this earlier?" She exhaled. "Because I knew you'd care. And I didn't want you involved. I already am. You're 23. So? This isn't a story you can fix, Isaac. This is a pattern I thought I had broken. And now someone else is tangled in it because I got careless." He stood up. "I didn't ask to be protected. And I didn't ask to be followed." They looked at each other for a long time without moving. He realized then that love wasn't always about staying in the room, it was sometimes about how long you could stay in it without turning it into something worse. Later that week, Juliet told her sister. Not over the phone, but in person. She drove into the city and returned late, saying nothing when she stepped into the house until Isaac asked her how it went. She said her sister hadn't been surprised. She had assumed there was someone but didn't expect someone his age. She had asked all the obvious questions, made all the careful remarks about power and timing and whether Juliet was chasing something she thought she had missed out on. But in the end, she hadn't warned her to stop. She had just said, "Be careful with someone who hasn't been broken yet." Juliet told Isaac that part last, then said, "She's wrong. You've been broken." He replied, "Maybe. But not by you." The conversation ended there, but neither of them forgot it. 2 days later, the town's annual public library fundraiser was held at the old courthouse, a building that hadn't seen real use in years except for these kinds of events. Juliet was invited by someone from the bookstore's donor list who didn't know her well enough to suspect anything. Isaac wasn't on the guest list, but Juliet asked him to come anyway. Not to stand beside her, not to make a statement, just to be in the room. He arrived 30 minutes after it started, dressed in a shirt he hadn't worn since college interviews. He moved through the crowd quietly, picking up a drink he didn't sip, avoiding the corners where people who knew each other gathered to swap opinions about school budgets and local grants. Then he saw her. Juliet stood near the back, wearing black, her hair tied low, her face the same unreadable expression she always used in places that didn't deserve more. She caught his eyes and smiled, not widely, but enough to mark the moment. He stepped closer. People noticed. He heard a whisper. Someone said his name. He didn't know who. Then came the man. Daniel wasn't announced. He just appeared, tall, gray suit, clean-shaven, no tie. He looked like someone who had just come from a boardroom or was on his way to make someone else uncomfortable. He walked straight toward Juliet, not even glancing at Isaac, and said her name like it was a test. Juliet. She didn't flinch. You're not supposed to be here. I was invited. I've supported this library for years. I didn't expect to see you. That's not true. He turned to Isaac then, as if seeing him for the first time, and smiled in that practiced way people use when they've already decided what they want the other person to do. You must be Isaac. Isaac nodded. And you must be the reason she can't sleep. Juliet moved between them before anything else could be said, but the damage was already done. People around them had stopped talking. Some recognized Daniel. Some recognized Isaac. Everyone recognized what the silence meant. Daniel looked at Juliet again. You've made your choice. She didn't respond. Isaac took her hand. Not tightly. Just enough that people noticed. The rest of the evening passed, but no one forgot what happened. After the fundraiser, Isaac didn't go to Juliet's house. He didn't wait for a message and he didn't send one. He went home, changed clothes, and sat in the kitchen for 2 hours staring at nothing, trying to decide if silence meant he had done the right thing or if it meant she had chosen not to correct what had gone wrong in front of everyone. By the time he finally lay down, it was already light outside. When he woke, there was a note under his door in the same handwriting as before. This one said only, "If you want to talk, I'll be at the bookstore." He went, even though he already knew there was nothing left to clarify. When he walked in, she was sitting near the back in the same spot she had always used, not hiding, not pretending, not trying to make the moment easier. He sat across from her without saying anything. There were no books between them this time. No small talk. No playful remarks. Just two people who had finally run out of space to stretch what was left. She said she wasn't sorry for what had happened at the courthouse. She said Daniel had always believed she would either come back or break, and what happened proved that she hadn't done either. She said she didn't regret Isaac, that none of it had been a game, that everything she gave him had been real, even the silences. She said it like someone who had waited a long time to be believed. He asked her what came next. She didn't answer right away. Then she said she had made arrangements to leave town by the end of the month. She wasn't being pushed out, but staying would mean living under the eye of someone who wouldn't stop watching until she was alone again. She said she wasn't scared, just tired. She said she had hoped things might be different, but hope had a time limit. Isaac asked if she wanted him to come with her. She looked away for the first time in the entire conversation. Then she asked him if he was ready to follow someone who didn't know where she was going. He didn't answer. Not because he was unsure, but because part of him already knew what she was trying to say. She had never promised anything past the present. She had let him in knowing it might end. And now that it was ending, she wasn't pretending it could be more than it was. He asked her if it had meant anything. She nodded immediately. He asked her if it could have lasted. She said it wasn't about whether it could, it was about whether it should. And right now, with everything that had happened, it didn't make sense to keep pretending they could carry something this fragile through the weight of what followed them. She told him he had a future that didn't need to be tied to her past. She said it gently. Like someone who had already practiced the conversation more than once. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse her of quitting. He just sat there, listening, remembering every hour they had spent on that floor, every night they didn't speak, every word they didn't say out loud. He stood up, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small folded note he had written the night before when he still thought they had more time. He handed it to her, didn't wait for her to read it, and walked out. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then 9. The bookstore changed ownership again, and Juliet's name didn't come up. People in town stopped whispering, or if they did it somewhere else. Daniel never came back, not publicly, at least. Isaac went back to the florist shop, filled orders, swept the floor, smiled at customers, and stopped checking his phone every time it buzzed. Some nights, he walked past her old house. It was empty again, windows shuttered, the porch light burned out. No one talked about the woman who used to live there. That was how Willow Ridge worked. You were only interesting when you were in the middle of something people didn't understand. Once you were gone, they moved on. On the 12th day, Isaac got a postcard from an address he didn't recognize. It had no return name. Just a location in New Mexico in 2 sentences. I still smile when I think about the rain. Thank you for reminding me how to feel something. There was no signature. He didn't need one. He kept the card in the back of a book she had given him, the Rilke collection. He never replied. Not because he was angry. Not because he had moved on. But because some things don't require answers. Some things are meant to exist in a small, clear place between what happened and what could have. When people asked him about her, he didn't lie. He said she was smart. He said she was the first person who ever made him question whether timing really mattered. He said she didn't ruin anything. She just reminded him what it felt like to stop waiting. Sometimes at night, he walked through the bookstore again, alone, tracing the aisles they used to drift through without touching. He didn't do it to feel sorry. He did it to remember. Because not all love survives, and not all love should, but every love leaves something behind. And what that something is, well, that's the part no one else gets to decide.